Welcome. We are continuing a discussion of a funeral. The last time we met, one or two times, I can't even remember now. It was funeral practices and beliefs about the afterlife in biblical times. And as I was doing research for that discussion, I came across some interesting articles and one story that I had seen many years ago in the Talmud about talking with the dead. And the question is, are the dead aware of what's going on in this world? Um, so I'd open it and ask the question, what do you think? Um, you know, and by the way, there's no, I don't even know if there's an official position in Judaism, because remember, Judaism is much more focused about what you do, um, rather than what you're supposed to believe. I have actually two articles in addition to reading some Talmud on this. And one article is actually is pretty wild about the afterlife. But I'm curious as to what you believe about, and I'll just talk about awareness and contact with those who have died. Are are you aware of them? Do you believe that they are aware of you? Do you believe that interaction between worlds is possible? I'm curious as to your thinking.
Uh, Well, let me start. And I, past 15 years or so, I became very spiritual. And when my wife passed away 10 years ago, it was a great shock to me, physically, mentally, and
Mhm.
emotionally, after 53 years of marriage. And I know that she is in contact with me, and I talk to her almost every day, and I pray with her, and I know she came back as a monarch butterfly.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Any other
Right.
thoughts or beliefs about this subject that you want to share?
But in Iran, and maybe here is, they bring the soul of the dead people and ask them something.
They
And
what the soul? I missed the verb. They
they bring
they
it on the table. They sit around the round table, everybody, and ask if the soul of the dead, if you are here, show me some.
okay, so it's like a seance. Okay.
Yeah, they
Okay.
do. And when they
And
answer
when
the
you say they
question,
do it, are you talking about Jewish people or Muslim?
both.
Okay.
And
Okay.
then they answer correct. They they answer.
Okay. So yes, so there's experience of so the thing that always interests me, and I have a book and I need to go through it again called "Does the Soul Survive" by Rabbi Eli Spitz, and it talks about prior lives and communicating with the dead. And so again, as a scientist, I'm very interested when someone can give information that's not available otherwise. And there are examples of that. I mean, it's one thing, a guy is talking to a big room. I'm seeing someone's father with a first name beginning with an M. Well, if you have, 100 people there, someone is going to be in that boat. And I do think that there are people who are, I would say, extraordinarily intuitive and can read emotions. And so as a scientist, I'm really interested in examples of where someone says, and in this book, I think in Ellie Spitz's book, although I had trouble finding it, his wife actually goes to one of these things, and she reports a case where I think she tells someone about a ring in the family, and like the person she was talking to had no awareness of this ring. It was her mother's ring. And it turns out her sister took it when her mother died and never told her about it. So you have some examples like that where, as a scientist, I'm really interested. So Ken and Patricia.
So having read Rabbi Spitz's book and being a pretty much a believer in reincarnation, I believe that people move on after they pass away, they move on and get another life.
Hmm.
And so I'm not sure that they're available for communicating with. And one of the things, this is just a speculation, that in life, when you meet people, sometimes when you meet someone, you either immediately like them or you immediately dislike them. And one speculation is that it's a leftover from previous lives
Hmm.
that you had either a really good experience or a really bad
Right.
experience with that person.
Yeah. The Kabbalists believe that, and I talk about this at every funeral. The Kabbalists believe in reincarnation. That's a central teaching to Kabbalah, which makes it a central teaching in Chabad and Hasidic Judaism. And there is a teaching which also I believe the Hindus believe in and other religious traditions that speak of reincarnation, that groups of souls hang out together in successive incarnations. In this Gilgul would be the Hebrew word. In this incarnation, you might be brother and sister. In the next one, you might be teacher and student. You might be father and son. But groups of souls hang out together. That is one of the teachings. Paul.
Oh, yeah. My father's been dead for, let me see, he was 85 when he passed. So he's been dead for quite a while. I think 1914 is when he was born, and then he lived to be 85. And on my way in to see him on his deathbed, he lived in the San Fernando Valley. I was driving behind this bus, and all of a sudden, I see this puff of smoke come out of the stack of the bus. It was like a mushroom. It
Right.
came out of the tailpipe of the bus. It was one of those buses that emitted at the top. And I said to myself, I bet that's my dad up there going, because he was dying, and he passed away that day.
Hmm.
And um, for some reason, I went on today to some of these websites that have pictures of people who in your family who have passed away and what they look like and when they passed.
Hmm.
I started going through them, and I saw my uncles and my aunts, and I said, "Gee, this is interesting. I don't know why I all of a sudden started doing that.
Hmm.
I started to
Okay.
remember things about them, and
Okay.
it was quite interesting, because I got some good feelings inside me, and then I got some not so good feelings inside me. But it was interesting what happened to me."
Okay. Les?
I'll give you two instances with birds. I have no idea what birds mean. I don't think it's a soul coming back or anything like that. My mother was born in Germany, and she was in New York City up on the 14th floor with her aunt. Never seen a bird ever. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, a bird came up and started pecking on the window.
Oh my!
At that exact moment, her father had passed away in
Hmm.
Germany.
Oh
And
yeah!
my wife's father passed away about what's been about 20 years. And they were at their home, bird and all of a sudden a bird came and started pecking on the window when he had passed. Any idea what that's all about?
So, you know, I would say for some people who, like me, are scientifically inclined, you're looking for rock solid proof, and there are very few signs. And for the mystics, we are inundated with signs. And it's just that because we're so rational, we reject them. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. And so with that in mind, we're going to take a look at some Talmud.
Remember the bird with your father?
Uh,
My mother's father.
okay. So I presume you can see this is from Sefaria, and we're in the Talmud of Berachot 18b, and I'll just read it. Um, uh, yeah, this is interesting, and there's an article that's going to discuss this little bit of Talmud in detail. But as the article will point out, this word here, Vahatanya, Tanya means It's an Aramaic word. You can always spot Aramaic words because they end in an aleph. Um, but basically this identifies it as older material. Newer material in the Gemara is written in Aramaic. When it says Hatanya, now what we're going to read here is clearly, I mean, if you have an eye for Hebrew, it's clearly Hebrew, it's clearly not Aramaic. So it is called the Baraita. Baraita is an old teaching. It's usually, the Baraitas and the Mishnahs are usually very dry and cut. This one is not. So the issue they're discussing is, are the dead aware of the living? That's the question. And they're discussing it, and the Gemara challenges it and says, and is it so that the dead do not know of the pain of others? Wasn't it taught in a Baraita? There was an incident involving a pious man who gave a poor man a dinar on the eve of Rosh Hashanah during drought years, and his wife mocked him for giving so large a sum at so difficult a time. And in order to escape her incessant mockery, he went and slept in the cemetery. So this is, I wouldn't include this in my marriage, prenuptial counseling. If you're having a fight with your spouse, go try and sleep in the cemetery, but that happens here. That night in his dream, because it basically says, the text just says, he heard, Amrallah, he heard. So that when it says that night in his dream, they quote commentators that say he heard this in a dream. But evidently, he's in the cemetery and he hears two spirits conversing with each other. One said to the other, my friend, let us roam the world and hear from behind the heavenly curtain, paragod, which separates the divine presence from the world, what calamity will befall the world? The other spirit said to her, I cannot go with you as I am buried in a mat of reeds, but you go and tell me what you hear. As we'll see in the next article, being buried in a mat of reeds meant she was very poor and her family couldn't afford a casket or a decent shroud. They basically wove a shroud from grasses, and apparently that prevents her from roaming through the world, according to this Talmudic story. So the other one went and roamed and came back. The other spirit said, my friend, did you hear from behind the heavenly curtain? She replied, I heard that anyone who sows during the first rainy season of the year, hail will fall and strike his crops. Hearing this, the guy sleeping in the cemetery, the pious man went and sowed his seeds during the second rainy season. Ultimately, the crops of the entire world were stricken by hail, and his crops were not stricken. So I just want to make sure everybody understands the story. The guy is sleeping in the cemetery. He overhears two spirits talking, and they say, let's go find out what's going to happen in the world in the coming days. And they get a weather report. And the weather report influences when he should plant crops. And rather than planting at the normal time, he plants at a different time, and his crops do well, and everyone else's crops don't do well. Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
Did he tell about this when it happened or later on? Because I could easily see this being a case of somebody didn't do it.
All right. So yeah. So you're asking, is this an accurate description of something that actually happened?
I'm asking, what is the source for it in the sense of
Talmud. The source is the Talmud. The source is the Talmud.
I'm saying, what is the Talmud source? Is this
the Talmud? Okay, to be very specific, this is going to be very specific, very erudite and intellectual, and it's not going to help you one bit. Are you ready? So this is a Baraita. So in Jewish tradition, God spoke to, this is really going to be more confusing than anything else. God gave the oral law to Moses, right? On Mount Sinai. Gave written law and an oral law, and an oral tradition was passed down from scholar to student for over 1,000 years. And then in the year 200 of the Common Era, the leader the leading rabbi of the time, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, which means Rabbi Judah the Prince, decides if I don't write down the most important parts of the oral law, we're going to lose it because it's written down, because it's not written down, it's oral. So he takes what he considers to be the most important parts of the oral law and writes them down in a book called the Mishnah. But as we look at the Talmud, we see a lot of material that are as old as the Mishnah, and they're in Hebrew, but they're not part of the Mishnah. They're called Baraitas. And so this is a Baraita. So this is the oral tradition as handed down and gets codified, I would say in the first half of the first millennia Common Era.
Okay, so
and there's stories. And one of the things, sometimes I'm tempted to do this, but I don't do it. There are some pretty wild, crazy things in the Talmud, and I'm very reluctant to bring them to you because they would cast ridicule upon the Talmud. So this is a story. It's a rabbinic story. You can believe it, you can't believe it. My subject is not what really happens. Are the dead really aware of our lives? But my question is, what does the Talmud and Jewish tradition say about that question?
But so this is not part of what God told to Moses on Mount Sinai.
How do you know?
Well, because you said this wasn't, that the Baraitas are what got added in, that were not in the Mishnah.
No, but okay, so I wasn't clear. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi took what he considered to be the most important parts of the oral law and wrote them down in a book called the Mishnah.
Right.
By looking at the other parts of the oral law, which are the Baraitas, we see that the Mishnah is only about 1/6 of the material that existed at the time.
Okay, so
and it still would fit an 800-page book.
So both the Baraitas and the Mishnah were from the oral Torah that God gave Moses. Okay.
I would say they were from the oral tradition, whether you believe, and I don't believe this, whether you believe that God literally dictated this to Moses on Sinai is a matter of what you believe.
Okay. What I was getting at originally, and we can sort of get off the subject, was I could easily see this being a case of man plans the stuff late because he procrastinated or for whatever other reason.
Okay, but we need to read the second paragraph.
By chance, his crops are spared due to his lateness when everybody else is ruined, and so he makes up this story as to why he was deliberately late about it.
Right. Okay, so let's read the second story, because in the second story, he's going to do the reverse. The following year, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the same pious man went and slept in the cemetery at his own initiative. So his wife didn't nag him into sleeping there. And he heard two spirits conversing with each other. One said to the other, "Let us roam the world and hear from behind the heavenly curtain." I'm trying to remember, yeah. Poor Anut. Okay, the heavenly curtain, what calamity will befall the world? She said to her, "My friend, have I not already told you? I cannot, as I am buried in a mat of reeds. Rather, you go and tell me what you hear." She went and roamed and returned. The other spirit said to her, "My friend, what did you hear from behind the curtain?" She said to her, "I heard that those who sow during the second rainy season, blight will strike his crops. That pious man went and sowed during the first rainy season, the opposite of the year before. Since everyone else, based on what happened the year before, sowed during the second rainy season, ultimately the crops of the entire world were blighted and his crops were not blighted." So we have two weather experiences, not just a one. Okay, so the pious man's wife said to him, "Why is it that last year the crops of the entire world were stricken and yours were not stricken? And now this year the crops of the entire world were blighted and yours were not blighted?" He related to her the entire story. They said, "It was not even a few days later that a quarrel fell between the pious man's wife and the mother of the young woman who was buried there." So this was the woman who was buried in the mats that couldn't roam. The pious man's wife said to her scornfully, "Go and I will show you your daughter and you will see that she is buried in a mat of reeds. So here's an interesting thing, at least according to the story, that this woman knew the whole story, and she knew that this other woman, his wife, knew the whole story. She knew that the other woman's daughter was buried in a mat of reeds, which apparently is embarrassing to her. And how did she know this? I mean, she only knew it due to this story. The plot continues. The following year, he again went and slept in the cemetery and heard the same spirits conversing with each other. One said to the other, "My friend, let us roam the world and hear from behind the heavenly curtain what calamity will befall the world." She said to her, "My friend, leave me alone, as words that we have privately exchanged between us have already been heard among the living. Apparently, the dead know what transpires in this world." Yeah, I don't plan to go further with this particular story. So it's a discussion in the Talmud. There's not much in the Talmud that talks about things like this, that at least believes that there is communication between worlds and there's knowledge in the next world about what is happening in this world. And of course, the Talmud is fairly early and would not address the idea of reincarnation. It does address the idea of resurrection. Paul.
Yeah, I was watching a television program on physics this afternoon, and I heard the term the butterfly effect. And what I understand is that a butterfly in another country could flap its wings, and the flapping of the wings can cause air to come across the countries, and it could end up in another country, and the flapping the wings would be there. And I thought to myself, does this have anything to do with what we're talking about? I mean, they talked about in this movie, they talked about, is God really real? Is God real? And is he making all these things up that are happening here in this world? So I don't know, and maybe it could be that some people are talking to each other in another language or another place based on something like the butterfly effect. I don't know. I'm just guessing.
Okay. So since I am also a physicist, I would say my understanding of the butterfly effect is that anything that happens, let's just take the atmosphere.
Yes.
In theory, can have an effect. And
right.
I'll give you an example which you might find interesting. I mean, I don't know if this is a good example, but it's the one that comes to mind. There's such a thing called a super cooled fluid. So imagine you have water and you cool it down to below 32 degrees.
Right.
But it hasn't frozen. Okay? And you put a crystal or a grain of sand in it, and all of a sudden it freezes instantly.
Right.
So when you have systems, something can affect other parts of the system.
Right.
But what I would say is, well, I think that's true theoretically. I don't believe for a second that the actions of a butterfly can have any meaningful effect on the atmosphere any distance away from the butterfly.
Yes.
And I'll go to an actual example from my professional area of competence, which is wind power. Okay.
Yes. Okay.
If you're going to put windmills onto a plane, the Great Plains, you have a windy area and you're going to put windmills on. If you put windmills close to each other and the wind is blowing from this windmill to this windmill is going to suck a bunch of the energy out of the wind. The wind velocity will be reduced and this windmill won't have as much wind, right?
Won't have as much wind, yeah.
Okay. The rule of thumb in wind power, I don't know if it's still the rule of thumb, is 10 rotor diameters. If you're 10 rotor diameters away, then you don't have a meaningful reduction in the amount of energy. Now, you still may have some turbulence. I mean, one of the other things I did for a while was I was a private pilot and I flew airplanes.
Wow.
And they caution you, if you're following a big plane, there are vortices that come
Right.
off the wings of the big plane, and you do
Sure.
not want to be anywhere near behind that big plane. So this exists, but I for one would say that while I agree in theory that a butterfly in Morocco could cause a brick to fall on my head
Yes.
in Camarillo,
Yeah.
I believe the probability is vanishingly small.
I see.
And
Okay.
I don't know what that has to do with the existence of God.
They
As far as I'm concerned,
they talked about it.
we're
They
just talking
talked about
theory.
it. Can this be something godly that is happening in our universe? That's what they.
I wouldn't understand how that connection would be made.
Yeah. Okay.
Ken and Patricia.
I was thinking that my understanding of the butterfly effect is that it's sort of like a Goldberg machine that the butterfly initiates a series of events. So something because of the butterfly leads to another thing, leads to another
Yeah.
thing, leads to another thing, and eventually it could be something that results in some sort of a disaster or something, but it isn't directly from the flapping of the butterfly wing
Yes.
to
Yes.
that event. There's a whole
Yes.
series of
Yes.
intervening.
Yes. And you can think of, I don't know, of lighting a match, which doesn't seem like a tremendous thing in the world. And then you take that match and you light a fuse going to a stick of dynamite. So events can be connected. Anyway, I don't think that's what they're getting at in this particular story. So I want to now go to an article. Whoops, what happened? Okay. And I'm going to do a screen share again. I discontinued it for a second. So this article will actually cover a fair amount of what we just read. It's a little repetitious, but it'll also give insights that this scholar from JTS. JTS is the Jewish Theological Seminary. It's the major seminary of conservative Judaism. And I certainly know the name Boyarin. I don't know if he's the Boyarin I'm thinking of. Actually, I have some books by. Okay. So would someone like to read? Or I can read if nobody, the print is a little small. Yeah, go ahead, Ken. And the article is about the Torah portion of the week. So that's why his opening comments are as they seem.
This week's Torah portion begins with the words "after the death," referring to the death of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu.
So there's a portion in the Torah which talks about the deaths of Aaron's sons, a very interesting portion, and it's called Acharei Mot, which means after the death.
I appreciate the chance to contribute this week's commentary since I'm currently teaching a course titled Death, Dying, and the Dead at JTS. Much of the course is about Jewish death rituals, but I also aim to convince my students that Jewishness per se is inconceivable without some notion of the continuing presence of the dead in the world of the living. The tradition, for the most part, seems to take this continued presence for granted, though questions arose about exactly how it manifests.
Actually, that's an interesting statement. And this guy is let's see, he is a professor of modern Jewish thought at Cornell University and an adjunct professor at JTS. So I will rely on his authority. Jewishness per se is inconceivable without some notion of the continuing presence of the dead in the world of the living. So I think that's just important for us to think about, because I talk to many Jews who are absolutely convinced that Judaism does not teach anything about survival of the soul and the afterlife. And my own private theory about that is the idea that since the afterlife is so important to Christians, and actually in the next article, which I'm sure we won't get to tonight, since the afterlife is so important to Christians and Christianity, we Jews must not believe in it at all. I think that's almost like a knee-jerk reaction. But it's not true. So anyway, that's I don't know if you read this last sentence, the tradition for the most part. Okay, so let's continue.
A brief Hasidic tale reflects some skepticism about the extent to which the presence of the dead is like that of the living. I heard it from my friend Rabbi Shimon Schneebald, a neighbor on the Lower East Side. It is said that the Rebbe of Lelev had the practice of giving his deceased father-in-law's alios, that is, calling him to recite the blessings over the reading of a section of the Sabbath Torah portion. The son-in-law claimed that he was able to hear his father-in-law pronounce the blessings, and it was further said that the congregation responded hearing the son-in-law respond, Amen. When the Rebbe of Ger was told about this practice, his response was Takeh.
No, let me just read it. Anybody here really good at Yiddish? Okay, so it's taka mizolif given chagba. So taka is it the takas the tach? Is this the true? So let him do hagba. Hagba is where he lifts the Torah. So this rabbi is saying, oh yeah, if this is true, I want to see your dead father-in-law lift up the Torah for hagba. You know, it's when we lift it up and we say Torah. Okay. That is what you just
That is, they should see if his father-in-law can lift up the Torah scroll. So maybe it's easier to talk to your own dead than to believe the others talk to theirs. We should not, in any case, suppose that the idea of death as at least partial oblivion is entirely a modern aberration. As long ago as the rabbinic period, and doubtless long before, the question whether the dead had any consciousness, let alone agency, was being actively debated. The Babylonian Talmud famously debates this issue. I quote from Art Scroll Elucidation.
And he's going to describe what we just read.
Rabbi Hia and Rabbi Yochanan were walking in a cemetery, and Rabbi Yonason's tzitzits were dragging over the grave.
I'm sorry. This is actually a different story. I thought, and anyway, yeah. So this is another interesting story. So he was wearing tzitzit. He was wearing a talit, and his tzitzit were dragging on the ground in the cemetery.
Whereupon Rabbi Hia said to him, lift up your garment, lest the dead say, tomorrow they will be joining us, and now they mock us. The mockery referred to here has to do with the mitzvah.
It's just the way they edited it, with line breaks and so on.
The mitzvah of tzitzit. By letting his fringes touch the ground, Rabbi Hia suggests Rabbi Yonasan would be in effect teasing the dead, reminding them that they were no longer able to place their fringes on their own bodies, and indeed can no longer fulfill any mitzvah themselves. Rabbi Yonasan said to him, but do the dead know so much about what is going on in this world? But it is written in Kohelet, for the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing at all.
Kohelet, part of the Torah, it's called Ecclesiastes in English, Kohelet in Hebrew. So actually, you may not know this, but it is not traditional to wear a talit in a cemetery. So when I conduct weddings, which I do, I've got one on Saturday, I wear a talit. When I conduct a funeral, I would never, ever wear a talit. And if I see, a lot of times people who are not particularly knowledgeable will come to a funeral and they want to feel very Jewish. So they will bring along their bar mitzvah talit. And I will, and I'll say it's not necessarily not appropriate to wear a talit. But the reason for it is that it's seen as mocking the dead. And this story suggests that the dead are actually aware of it. And they're saying, you're going to be here soon, yet you're mocking us now. I thought that was kind of interesting. And it's also interesting that when you bury probably a man traditionally, he is buried in his talit, but one of the tzitzit are cut off. One of the four corners tzitzit are cut off to make it ineligible for the use as a kosher talit.
When the dead person reads from the Torah, okay, for a living person to read from the Torah, you need 9 other living people to compose your minyan of 10, including the one reading. When it's a dead person doing the reading, do you need 10 dead people? Do you need the person reading plus 9 living people?
I think this discussion indicates that nobody except the son-in-law believes that the guy was actually reading. So if such a condition would arise, then it would be up to the rabbi to decide whether or not he has a minyan or not. And if you were there, Stephen, and didn't accept his ruling, you could leave. Meaning he would not have the minyan.
Okay. More generally, though, the question is, can dead people be counted as part of a minyan?
No. Nor can they be called to an aliyah.
Hmm.
Okay, so we read this. Okay, so now he's actually going to discuss the story that we just read. Let's continue.
In the course of the ensuing discussion, one attempt to prove that the dead remain aware is brought as a baraita, that is, a statement attributed to the Tanaim, who are the authorities of the Mishnaic period. Remarkably, while most such statements quoted in the Babylonian Talmud tend to be short, declarative, and deal with halachic issues, this one, beginning at Barakot 17b, is an extended folktale. It happened that there was a certain pious man who gave a dinar to a poor man on the eve of Rosh Hashanah in a year of famine, and his wife reproved him for it. So he went and spent the night in a cemetery. There he heard 2 spirits conversing with each other. One said to the other, "My friend, let us roam the world and hear from behind the divine curtain what misfortune is to come to the world this year." Her friend replied, "I cannot come with you because I am buried in a matting of reeds." Apparently, this spirit didn't have the right clothes to venture beyond the cemetery. But you go and come back and relate to me whatever you hear.
So there's also a really interesting idea that I skipped over quickly. Apparently, if you're a spirit and you're dead and buried, you can wander the world and find out things, but only if you're buried, I guess, with the appropriate clothing, at least according to the story in the Talmud.
Upon her return, the wandering spirit relates that she heard the future foretold. The crops of anyone who plants this winter at the time of the first rain will be destroyed by hail. Hearing this, the pious man went and planted at the time of the second rain. Everyone's crops were destroyed except for his. The tale continues with the pious man spending a night in the cemetery the following year and overhearing the same conversation between the 2 spirits, this time with an opposite future foretold. "I heard that the crops of anyone who plants this winter at the time of the second rain will be blasted by a dry wind." Hearing this, he went and planted at the time of the first rain. Everyone's crops were blasted but his. The pious man's wife, cast as should be acknowledged as the villain of this story, wonders why the pious man has guessed right about the time of planting 2 years in a row, and the pious man tells her about the conversations he has overheard. They say that it was not a few days later when a quarrel broke out between the pious man's wife and the mother of that child whose spirit he had overheard in the cemetery. The wife said to the mother, "Come, I will show you your daughter buried in a matting of reeds," evidently a put down to a family that couldn't afford better burial shrouds for their daughter. The third year, when the poor man goes to the cemetery, the spirit buried in reed matting refuses her friend's propositions altogether. "My friend, leave me be. The words that we spoke between ourselves in years past have already been heard among the living."
Let's read one more paragraph and I'll call on Les.
Okay. Thus, the spirit declares that she doesn't want to know what next year's crops will be, for such foreknowledge has already been exploited by the living, and instead of gratitude, her dead spirit has been insulted. Your daughter is buried in a matting of reeds. The Talmud takes this as proof that indeed the dead do know what is going on in the world of the living.
Okay. Les.
Yeah, I find it interesting that the 2 spirits want to find out what misfortune is going to happen.
Yes.
Instead of what's going to be good happening, they want to know what misfortune. I just found that interesting.
Yeah, I agree with you. Of course, it moves the story along, but it could have easily said, let's find out what's going to happen in the future. So this is the ultimate insider trading for those of you keeping track. Let's see.
Well, it's
So yeah,
only
so sorry, go
insiders
ahead.
going to profit from the knowledge in some way, not if they're just curious.
Say again?
It's only insider trading if they were going to use it, be trading on the basis of the information, not if they're just curious about
No,
it.
but the guy who spent the night in the cemetery got insider information and he profited from that information, knowing when to plant. Anyway, let's not discuss whether this is a state crime, federal crime, a Tannaitic crime, or Talmudic crime. Let's continue, Ken. What's most remarkable?
Most remarkable of this whole Talmudic passage is perhaps that Rabbi Yonasan never seems even to imagine that the quote from Kohelet might mean what it suggests to a modern reader, that the dead have no awareness whatsoever. For him, it could only suggest their complete divorce from the affairs of the living. The modern idea that when you die, that's it, that nothing remains of the person whatsoever, was likely inconceivable to him.
So that's kind of interesting. I mean, when we read that quote from Kohelet, we would take the simple meaning that the dead are just unaware. But for Rabbi Yonatan, and in the Ashkenazi pronunciation, it's Yonasan. That's why we have that sort of interesting English representation. That idea is inconceivable, that the dead would be unaware. Okay, let's continue.
Is proof from a folktale enough to counter the declarations of Kohelet, traditionally regarded as written by none other than the wise King Solomon? We don't really need to decide, and the question must remain open. But I'm inclined to think that the view of not only most scholars in our tradition, but most of our people throughout the centuries has been that the dead remain somewhat with us, and that without them, we the living wouldn't begin to know how to be Jews.
Okay, I'm not 100% sure I understand or agree with that sentence, that the dead somehow remain with us, and without them, we wouldn't begin to know how to be Jews. I actually don't understand.
What is wrong with what to do without them?
Yes, I mean, I would understand it if he was saying that the idea that the soul survives and that there is some afterlife is essential to our understanding of Judaism. That I can accept, but I don't, and I think that's what he's really trying to say. It's sort of similar to what he said in the beginning of this article, but I don't see how it, in Irwin's word, what one has to do with the other. Less.
Well, if the sins of the father go down through generations, if my father or my grandfather imparts goodness into me, even though he's dead, he's still alive in me because he imparted values. So isn't that maybe
Right.
what they mean?
So I would say that that idea sounds a lot to me like a sort of a contemporary intellectual idea concept of the afterlife, which is to say the 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 dead live on in our memory of what they have done. And whether we actually suffer from their sins may be an interesting Jewish legal point. So if my father was a terrible sinner, um, am I actually liable for his sins? And what does that mean? Does that mean I need to present a sacrifice in the temple for my father's sins? Does it mean actually the next article is going to address the question, if you've sinned against a person and that person's dead, do you still have to ask that person for forgiveness? And we're going to actually see what Maimonides and Rambam says about that when we're going to see that next week. I don't think I'm going to start
I
that
think what I
article.
was saying is that in the Torah it
I,
says that the sins of the father, but what I'm talking about is,
but Ezekiel actually comes along and disputes that. But
well, see,
anyway,
like
you're
my
absolutely
father taught me that your word is your bond. And so for my whole life, I can't lie about anything. I tell only the truth. So is my father living through me then because he taught me that?
yes. So I would say that would be a modern understanding. I mean, I have deep values that I learned from my parents, and I transmit those values. I live those values in my life, and I transmit them to others. Um, that is a different question of whether my father is actually aware of what's going on in my life and well, that's one question. Is he aware of what's going on in my life and in life in the world? That's a question. The second question is, can he transmit information to me that is useful and novel? That's the second question. Those two questions are what this article is addressing. The idea that your parents influence you could certainly be true whether you're Jewish or not Jewish, or a teacher influences you. So I would say that's more rational than mystical. I think what we're dealing with here is definitely what I would describe as mystical. Ken.
I guess sort of along the same line, I was just thinking that our traditions are sort of left over from the people before us, and to that extent, I was thinking in particular, like in a family when a mother passes down recipes or a grandmother
Right.
passes down recipes, that those recipes, even though the grandmother is gone, she's still sort of living and influencing through those recipes. Or when someone who's passed away and you think in your mind, what would so and so do again, and trying to figure out how to behave to a certain extent, that you might say that they are still influencing the living, even though they're gone.
Yes, and I would say that again, that's rational. Um, but I think what that means is if you go out 10 generations, there's, it's there's nobody that remembers that person. And suppose you're doing that recipe and you're making the same mistake your mother and your grandmother made. Is it possible that in a dream, your great grandmother would come back and say, no, you're supposed to use a teaspoon of this, not a tablespoon. And then you try it and that works. Or in the case of this article, Does the Soul Survive? That someone comes and says, your sister has my ring and I really wanted it to be yours. And this person never even knew that her mother had a ring and that this was
Could
even
could you maybe say that an epiphany is perhaps a voice from the past that's telling you that it should be a
Yes. So you can say that. I don't know what the formal definition of the word epiphany is, except to know that the the example where it comes up is the idea that Jesus appears to St. Paul, to Saul of Tarsus on the road to Damascus. He has an epiphany, which is to say a vision of Jesus that affects him so profoundly he's struck blind, and he goes on to be he starts off as a Jew and a Pharisee, and he's struck blind by the encounter, and he goes on to basically write 2/3 of the New Testament. So I would say, yeah, I know you're looking up epiphany, and I can't wait to hear what you find. Did you look up epiphany? And now yeah, there you
Yes.
go.
Yeah, it does say the first one is a manifestation of Christ to the Gentiles as represented by the Magi, or yeah.
Oh,
The
that's interesting.
festival, yeah, the festival commemorating the Epiphany, or a manifestation of a divine or supernatural being. Many believe this scene to represent an epiphany of the goddess, I guess. A moment of sudden revelation or insight is another definition of epiphany.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So clearly, the primary meaning of the word epiphany is is supernatural and religious, but we can use it in other contexts as well. Good. I appreciate your epiphany of bringing that into our conversation. Um, yeah, I'm not going to start the other article. I think I reported, I don't know if it was a Monday night or Wednesday night or Saturday, but there was a time when Sonia had this vision of her dead aunt visiting her and looking for a place for her soul to be. And Sonia said, we're not going to have children. This was when, early in her first marriage. Sonia said, we're not going to have children. And on that same night, this same aunt visited her sister in Casablanca and said, I went to see Sonia and there was no room for me. And there was no way her mother could know this because there was no internet, there was no email. I mean, they wrote a letter and they found out that it was actually the same night. So there's a really interesting example. And I think I went on to tell the story that this dead aunt went, oh no, the word went out in Sonia's family. The next girl that's born has to have the name Anita, to be named after this dead aunt. And it was an Israeli woman who was named Yael, a good Hebrew name, but her middle name was Anat, which is close to Anita. Anat is also a Hebrew name. And the interesting thing was she never knew the story of why she was named Anat until she met Sonia, 40 years later at a wedding, and the two souls seem to be connected. I mean, somebody talked about this idea that you meet someone and you feel like you're connected. And I have since met her as well at a wedding in Paris. So that's the kind of thing that really interests me, where it's hard to imagine an explanation that doesn't somehow rely on the supernatural. To say, I walked into a room and I felt my father's presence. I have dreams about my father all the time. People will say, I can smell his pipe smoke or his, I have that all the time. I would say those can have, psychological meanings, which don't rely on a supernatural survival of soul. So I'm interested as a scientist of examples which require more than just the rational to explain, which is why that book, Does the Soul Survive, is so interesting. Lois, you're muted. You're muted, Lois. Lois, even supernaturally, I can't hear you. Now, there you go.
When I think about this, I think I've told most of you that I have a grandson who's adopted, and almost all of these stories talk about a relative. It's not like usually, although these Talmud stories were not always relatives, it's not like Moshe Rabbeinu comes and talks to you or Yitzhak Rabin. It's
Mm.
so if this is so real for people, what happens to someone like my grandson? And or is this, as my mother, we once asked my mother, what do you think is going on, Mom, after you die? And she said the same thing that's going on before you're born,
Okay, and I would say
which was
that's
in
Jewish tradition.
yeah. And the other thing is, I ask myself, why is this so important to people? And that I don't know if any of you do you know Mark Gellman, Rabbi Gellman.
Yes.
So Gellman it really believes in the soul surviving, and I've heard him lecture on it several times. But I'm like, why? And he has an answer. Why is this so important to people? But I also ask myself, what could you be doing instead of drain
Yes.
your
Yes.
cup over this? What would you be doing with yourself Jewishly? And
Oh,
those are my
okay. So I'm
comments.
going to ask two questions. First, do you remember what Gelman says or how?
I do.
Yeah.
Gelman has a shtick he does, someday you'll hear him, called The Banana and the Diamond.
Mm-hmm.
You can't forget Gelman. I mean, he's
I'm looking him
unbelievable.
up on the internet.
He says that people come to religion, including Judaism, looking for a diamond, and the Jews give them a banana.
Mm-hmm.
What he means is that people come to religion, the primary reason is, in his opinion, is for hope. And that the reason he believes that Christianity has been so much more successful in numbers than we have been is that the idea of life after death or salvation after death, if you believe in Jesus, gives people hope. And if we don't, that we've kind of abandoned this. He also and give them a banana instead of all this other nice stuff like community and he doesn't negate those things. He just says the main thing is in our tradition, and it is the idea of your soul going on after, and all of the Jewish texts that we're familiar with, and that's his basic idea. He has another part of it that I'm missing right now in my
Mark
memory, but
Gelman, not Neil Gilman.
No, no, not Neil Gilman.
Okay.
I know you sent
Yeah.
that
Yes.
stuff
Yes.
too. This is
Okay.
Mark Gilman. He's now in South Florida.
The funny thing
He's
is, when I Googled the banana and the diamond, all the references are the banana ball, the modern take on
yeah.
baseball. I
Well,
don't know if you're familiar with it.
you know who he was? He was well known several years ago for the God Squad. He and
Mhm.
a priest who was his friend, and they were on television all up and down the East Coast. He moved to the West Coast to be when he retired to be near his friends, and someone introduced him to Eddie Feinstein, our rabbi at Valley Bet Shalom, and he started speaking now and then. He believes we gave up the diamond because of the Holocaust that so many people had trouble believing, and also to be rational, to try to look like modern. And that's why we gave it up. And that's a mistake. He said we should be talking again about the Jewish tradition of life after death and the survival of the soul. But that's a little different than your question, which is if there is a life after death of a soul or whatever, does it know its own family? And how does that work if you're
I don't
Aiden?
think I said family. I think you're injecting family
Well,
because of your
every
concern about adoption.
conversation except the ones in the Talmud were about family. My aunt, my they were relatives. My grandfather, does he live on in me?
Well, the two or three that we read, but the ones in this book, Does the Soul Survive, are not about this guy's. Well,
Okay.
anyway, but it's a reasonable question. But yeah. Okay. I actually found it. If you Google the banana and the diamond Rabbi Gelman, then you start finding references to him.
He's
And that
a great character,
yeah,
but
and
he
including some
made me think
videos
about these
2
things in
hours
a new
long.
way.
So
Right.
so what I think you asked, which really caught my attention, is what difference does it make in your life if you believe this or you don't believe it?
Right.
I often raise this question with belief in God. And the way I always introduce it is I ask how many people believe that there is a North Pole? And everybody that sort of knows what I'm talking about agrees that there's an axis of rotation of the Earth and that there's a North Pole. And then I say, okay, how does that belief affect your life? And for most people, I guess unless you're a navigator, it doesn't really affect your life. And so then I would ask the same question about God. Um, People may or may not believe in God. That's interesting. But the more interesting question for me is how does that belief or lack of belief affect your life and the way you live your life? So I find that interesting. And I want to inject one more thought, and then I'll call on Erwin. In the article we're going to read, and I'm going to distribute that article tonight, which is called, it's from something called Torah.org, which I've now subscribed to, and it's a commentary on on the Mishnah Torah, not to be confused with the Mishnah, Rambam's code of law about contacting the dead. And this author makes what I think is a fascinating observation. I wish, maybe I'm glad that Jim is not here. Jim, if you're listening to this, you have my apologies in advance. He says, he says, Christianity is a religion which is really focused on people trying to understand God. And then he goes on and talks about how it gives hope in the afterlife, and all the problems in this world are not such a big deal because we have hope in the next world about living a wonderful life with Jesus. He says, and I never thought about this before, so I need to think a lot more about it, but I find it to be a revolutionary thought. He says Judaism and the Bible is the story not of people trying to understand God, but of God trying to understand people. So I had to say that again because it's so radical. He claims the Bible is the story of God trying to understand people. And what he says is the response to the banana and the diamond, and I'm curious to know, what people's reaction is to this is And by the way, if I'm hungry, I think I would rather have a banana than a diamond. Just saying. But the focus of Judaism is, how do I make this world a better place? Rather than being filled with joy and hope in the knowledge that the next world is going to be so fantastic. So what gives you more joy, fulfillment, and hope? Working hard to make this world a better place, or working hard to make sure your soul will be in a better place after you die? And actually, the next article we'll discuss next week goes through his argument on this, and I found it very interesting. Erwin.
For me, to know that my wife can be reached,
Mm-hmm.
it gives me comfort and peace of mind.
Yeah.
And
And
when I pray, I don't just sit down and start mouthing the prayers.
right.
I wait a good couple of minutes till I am in that mode to
Mm-hmm.
uh, make the connection, so to speak.
Right.
And for me to know that God exists and I am part of the universe where God exists, is I try to do uh, what I can to make this world a better place.
Right. And I would say that is very much a Jewish approach. And by the way, I think it's also a Christian approach. Christians generally work hard to make the world a better place. They may do it with a different theological motivation, but I have many good Christian friends who spend their vacations, working with destitute people in the jungle somewhere, trying to teach and, Peace Corps kinds of things. The other thing that I would point to, and Lois, another thing you made me think of, is this idea that it's comforting to believe in God, to believe that others can hear you and you, can communicate with them. And as one of my teachers once pointed out, is saying, just because something is comforting doesn't mean it's not true. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is true, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true. I guess you could call it a religious placebo effect, which I kind of like. So that's anyway, but it's a very interesting discussion, and we'll get into it in even more detail through the eyes of Rambam, who is now 1,000 years later and writing codes of Jewish law on the subject, and a pretty interesting article, which I will distribute tonight to you all.
Okay.
Unless, of course, the Dodgers lose, in which case I no longer believe in God.
They're losing. They're losing.
Don't tell me that. Don't tell me that, because I do have it recorded. Yeah, it didn't look good even from the beginning.
Laila Tov, Rabbi.
Laila Tov, Erev Tov, and Gamze Yavor. This too shall pass.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
They're
Okay.
losing as punishment for leaving Brooklyn.
Sorry. Right. It's a punishment for leaving in Brooklyn. That at least makes logical and rational sense, particularly if you're from Brooklyn. Okay. Good night, all.